inhumane way themselves. Sadly, I think the victims were martyrs to a cause, to a narrative that's trying to silence free speech through blacklisting and violence. And it's being carried out by people who think they are allowed to commit assault to stop other people from speaking. Uh, you know who I'm talking about, namely the people that say things like, quote, "It's okay to punch a Nazi," end quote, or "Fascists have no freedom of speech." These groups, then feel justified in assaulting people. These Antifa and BLM groups, they feel, justified in assaulting people spreading unpopular speech because they've pardoned themselves in advance for doing it. Um, those monuments to Civil War people, they've been there forever in the South. The people that have been pushing to have all of them removed knew full well in advance that it would elicit a response, and probably a violent one, and they did it anyway. Now, the alt-right group could have done things differently. And at the start, when this protest was being organized, it sounded like it was going to be an event for not just white nationalists or white racists, but for all people that thought the monuments should stay in place for whatever reason. And then it morphed into this white nationalist, hate fest. But in all honesty, had they been allowed to march and people just stood by and watched as the stupid Nazis waved their stupid flags and Hitler signs and whatever and just walked down the street, not much more would have happened after that. And if the memorial hadn't been taken down, we wouldn't have even had to sit there and watch as the stupid Nazis did their little parade. But as it was, things happen. When you have these groups that organize things like this, and then you have the counter protesters that show up, trying to silence them by shouting them down and physically assaulting them with, bombs of blood and balloons filled with urine and things like that, it's going to get out of hand. It's designed to get out of hand, and the police have to be there and to keep it from happening. And I'm not blaming this entirely on the police. I think it probably has something to do with the people who gave the orders for the police to stand down, if that's in fact what happened. Maybe they were stretched too thin. Maybe it was department cuts. Who knows what was happening there. But, when you look at this thing as a whole, it seems like it was bound to happen, or it was let to happen. And this mess could have been avoided, definitely. But something is happening now in this country that's leading us down a dark path, and I'd rather we not go down it. We are as a nation allowing ourselves to be divided along racial lines and political lines, just like in the days of the Confederacy, conveniently since the monument is such a big issue here. But even though, in the days of the Confederacy, it wasn't just a black and white issue. It wasn't just an issue of race relations. It was a political divide too. It was also about man's inhumanity to man, and what role the government had in helping us to, like Lincoln said, appeal to the better angels of our nature. The Civil War was not simply one all-white, completely pro-racist military force against a mixed race, totally anti-slavery, righteous, military unit. And when analyzed in the historical context of the Civil War era, one can understand how all the history and figures of that awful time are relevant to what's going on today. We should be studying these people, not trying to erase them from our history. And this goes back to that famous dictum: those who don't know history, doomed to repeat it. All that aside, I think this could have been avoided. I think it's sad that it wasn't. And I hope we're not headed in the wrong direction again. Those monuments are representations of extraordinary men who lived in extraordinary times. They're not simply memorials to racist white men revered by other racist white men. And unlike what both sides of this debate seem to believe, these men were neither all good nor all bad. Just because we have memorials to them doesn't mean we support everything that they did with their lives, nor should we condemn everything that they did either. They were just men. They were neither all good nor all bad. Just because we have memorials to them doesn't mean we have to support everything they did in their lives, nor should we condemn their lives entirely and obliterate them from the history books and public squares. We have monuments to Lincoln, Jefferson, Washington. Each of them owned slaves or didn't go full force in favor of full equality for black people. So, yet they were extraordinary men living in extraordinary times. But if we are to ignore all of the extraordinary men who fought on the side of the Confederacy, then where's the line going to be as to what's acceptable and what isn't? Do we need to now rid ourselves of the Lincoln Memorial and Washington Monument, or burn the Declaration of Independence because its writer owned slaves? These are questions that should have been intelligently explored before a widespread movement to remove these monuments had been put into place. But alas, it wasn't. Understandably, black people feel bad about slavery. And so does most of the population. But whereas some black people could walk by the Lee Memorial, not feel any type of way about it, many people, don't get offended. And for those that do get offended at the mere sight of the memorial, are we needing to erase them from the history books because somebody got offended? I hope not.
For example, take W.E.B. Du Bois. He founded the NAACP, fought against racism practically his whole life, did a lot of great things, an extraordinary man. And yet, if we were to focus entirely on the fact that he at one point thought that Hitler and Stalin were great guys, we would have to discount everything that he stood for based on the fact that he thought two guys that ended up being bad were good at one point.
We might have to stop honoring him for all the good that he did, which far outweighs the bad things that he seemed to believe in, by the way. Just because some people may be offended by certain aspects of his life doesn't mean we need to ditch him from history, You see what I mean? Things require context. Hitler and Stalin did appear as good men for a while. And so we can't judge these people with our 2020 hindsight vision, acting all superior from their future. For those that are offended by the Lee statue, I just have to say, I think you should get thicker skin. It's not as if it's a statue to Hitler. It's a statue to a man who, by the context of his times, was a decent human being. By no means was he a saint, neither was Lincoln, Washington, Jefferson, but these are people that were important to our past, and we shouldn't obliterate them from our history books. So that's all I mean by that. And lastly, I'll just say this. It seems to me that the progressive movement seems dead set on erasing the work of our founding fathers by scrubbing our history and rewriting their prescriptions for the American experiment into one vision that's decidedly socialistic and multicultural, free of capitalism and full of the false notion that a utopia is somehow possible. We'll never have paradise on earth because humanity is messy, history is messy, free speech is messy. We can't ditch our freedoms because things get messy. So, I don't think if we forget history, we're doomed to repeat it. I don't think there'll be another civil war based on the color of whose skin is what color, but it is very possible at this rate that at some time in the future there will be another civil war based off of freedoms being taken away, like freedom of speech. And while I'd never fight against my fellow man on the basis of skin color, I certainly would take up arms one day to protect my freedom of speech. I hope you would too.
To kind of tie all this back in, those people showed up there that day to espouse some pretty awful, vile things. And they should have been allowed to express these horrible things and say these horrible things, because that's what freedom of speech is about. We can listen to other people speak about things that make us uncomfortable and that we don't agree with. That doesn't mean that we agree with them just because we listened. We don't have to resort to violence. And both sides did that day, and it led to death.